Welcome to this bonus episode of The Reading Cure. In this episode, we'll be discussing the film The Shawshank Redemption, directed by Frank Darabont. Welcome to The Reading Cure, your monthly dose of bibliotherapy. My name is Dr. Stephen Davis, and my co-host is Dr. Alexander Fox. Now, in this bonus episode, as we've done previously, we'll be discussing a film rather than the book. The movie we're going to talk about is The Shawshank Redemption, a much-loved and critically acclaimed American movie released in 1994, based on a Stephen King short story. Now, the film was adapted for the screen and also directed by Frank Darabont, who would go on to adapt King's 1996 novel The Green Mile 5 years later. The Shawshank Redemption stars Tim Robbins as Andy Dufrene, a man who has been wrongly convicted of murdering his wife and her lover and is sentenced to serve 2 life sentences at Shawshank State Prison. In time, Andy befriends Ellis Redding, known as Red, played by Morgan Freeman, who has become an adept and well-connected smuggler of contraband during his long tenure in the prison. In their first conversation that we see, Andy asks Red to procure him a rock hammer, which he says is for doing some amateur geology. He later also requests a large poster of the actress Rita Hayworth for his cell wall. And during his 19 years in Shawshank, the same spot on Andy's wall remains covered by posters of famous actresses. And of course, famously, we later discover why this is. Andy has been using his tiny rock hammer to incrementally scrape away at the wall behind the poster and eventually carve out an escape tunnel, which he uses to gain his freedom. During his time in Shawshank, former banker Andy strategically assists staff with their tax returns and ultimately comes to manage what is essentially a vast money laundering enterprise constructed by the prison's warden in order to exploit the prisoners as a virtual slave labour force with which to enrich himself. Andy uses this favoured position with prison staff to gain privileges for his fellow inmates, notably in the creation of a well-supplied prison library in which Andy, as chief librarian, assists other inmates in gaining qualifications. Moreover, Andy's financial savvy is such that he has created bank accounts with aliases to house the warden's ill-begotten gains, but which he himself will come to cash in upon as part of his masterful escape plan. Following Andy's disappearance, his now close friend Red is left somewhat bereft, and when he is finally granted parole after 40 years of imprisonment, finds himself alone and in despair as he unsuccessfully tries to rejoin society. Fortunately though for Red, Andy has woven his friend into his ingenious escape plan and has left a box with money and directions for Red that allow him to follow Andy to his idyllic new life on the Pacific coast of Mexico. The film was nominated for 7 Academy Awards in 1995, including Best Actor nominations for both Freeman and Robbins. It has been enduringly popular since the late 1990s and has remained top or close to the top of the IMDb user-generated charts throughout the last 20 years. So the first question, Alec, about the Shawshank Redemption tonight is about the main character, Andy Dufrene. In this film, he displays a mixture of courage, patience, inscrutability, and savvy, a range of qualities. I was wondering what you made of him as a character and how much he struck you as being plausible.
Yeah, well, if we're looking at the issue of plausibility, I think we have to bear in mind that this is a very rare kind of person, as I think it's depicted in the movie. Out of all the prisoners, he is someone that is very different to the rest, not just because he was innocent, even though that is one of his distinguishing features in that prison, but also his way of being is very different. So I think he is a very rare kind of person, and as far as a character in a movie goes, there is a plausibility to him. There was an internal coherence to the character. I didn't feel there was any aspect of him that sort of contradicted any other traits. So I did get a sense of substantiality because he did the traits did kind of form this interesting coherence, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
I mean,
absolutely.
for me, what struck me the most regarding him was, if I was to put it in a phrase, that he was a shrewd idealist. And
Okay.
that's an interesting juxtaposition, because he was not an idealist in the sort of pie in the sky way. You know,
No.
someone that was simply a dreamer but did not do anything about it. He was a shrewd idealist. He took pains to start up that library.
Yep.
Even though he was mailing those letters for 6 years to get funding, there was this extraordinary patience and resilience, which is obviously reflected in how he deals with the jail itself. So he would attach himself or create these idealistic causes. But there was also a shrewdness to it, because this is where some of the nuance of the film comes into being, in that, the things that he did to help the prisoners were also things that were helping him ultimately to escape. So,
Yeah.
I mean, I'll give you the example of the prisoners tarmacking the roof, and he gives some financial advice to the cruelest and most callous screw, in the prison.
Yep.
And he asks only in return for them, the men to get ice cold beers, at the end, during their shift, which is obviously, this very touching gesture for the men, lending them this dignity that the imprisonment had denied them, especially the way that particular prison officer had treated them.
Yes.
But there is another aspect to it, which is also that he is building up this trust with, the prison establishment, which then allows them to do the books, which then allows them to basically have this sort of luxury cell in a way, or accorded a degree of trust that other prisoners aren't given, which then allows them to create this tunnel and finally escape. So I think that, I'm not reading it cynically. I'm just reading it on a number of levels, which is that, he is a shrewd idealist. He was thinking of others, and he was also thinking about his own escape ultimately too.
Yeah, I would agree with that assessment, Alec. I think you're right. I mean, I'd also written, in my notes that, whether or not he's a realistic person, he would be a remarkably rare individual. And I think you're right, the way that you summed it up there. He is a coherent character, and I think the choice of Tim Robbins was a good one for that part, because he's quite a kind of understated actor. I thought it was interesting. I read, just looking at some of the reviews and things that came out when the film was first released, there was quite a mixed response to his character. And just a few quotes I noted down. Some critic had said laconic good guy, Neo Gary Cooper. Somebody else had said cheesily messianic, comparing him to Forrest Gump going to jail, which I thought was really, there was quite a lot of just maybe negativity about the fact he was a somewhat understated character in his presentation. But I really feel that, no, I think he is actually a really deep and interesting character. I think maybe, and I agree with your point about the shrewd pragmatism, the shrewd idealism, a remarkable mix. What did strike me perhaps in terms of, realism is you could say that he, just prior to that, obviously he's been, in a real state in his life. He's obviously had alcohol issues. His wife's been murdered. He's been through this wrongful conviction. And you could say that it would probably be more typical for a person who had been through that experience and whose life was in a bit of a state of disintegration to disintegrate further when thrown into such a brutal environment as that prison, rather than become this really, incredibly self-possessed and, mission-oriented person. But on the other hand, you can tell me what you think about that. To me, I thought, well, maybe this is just what somebody does when they see how much their life is in danger. Even if it has been a shambles, they draw deep down on the inner toughness and resilience they have because they need to, or they won't survive. So
Well, my thoughts on it, yeah, I can see your point, and it raises the question about whether Andy Dufrene is meant to be realistic in the more sort of literary sense, like a realistic character in that way, or whether he's to be more archetypal in some way. Now, I think the answer to the issue of how plausible it is that he maintains or actually develops his integrity in prison, how plausible that is would be dependent on knowing more about his past, which is something that is conveniently denied. It's just sketched out for us in the movie. We don't really have any visceral sense of that past. It's not really portrayed to us. It's not really explained in any depth. So while it's intimated he had those problems, because there's no real detail, then this Andy Dufrene of Shawshank, it isn't then implausible, because to say it was implausible would be to have to know more about his history.
Good point.
Really, there. So I think that was I think that was probably one of the intentions. Also, if you look at the Green Mile, which is another Stephen King adaptation.
Sure.
If you look at John Coffey, the character, again, while it's not by any means identical with Andy Dufrene, both of them are messianic almost in some ways.
Yes.
And I think they perform in some ways a similar function in the narrative. And they're not meant to have quite the full drawn out history of what a character would have in a more realistic movie.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. I think the balance is actually perfectly struck in this film, because it's more or less just in the opening credits you get these flashback scenes to his alcoholism and the murder. So it's so sparse, and as you say, so therefore nothing that happens subsequently could be construed as a contradiction. That's true. On the other hand, there is, I mean, again, you've probably come across this or thought this yourself, but a lot of critics, I think Mark Kermode, the film critic, had mentioned that the religious symbolism, the idea that he has Christ-like qualities, he's maybe a symbolic character. There might be something to that.
Well, there could be, and I mean, the fact that King also has John Coffey as a Christ-like character, JC, in the Green Mile. I mean, Stephen King is a Christian, and he believes in good and evil in that Christian way. So it wouldn't be a surprise then that if he was portraying Christ-like figures, not exactly like Christ, obviously, but having that quality of, stubborn goodness. In the case of John Coffey, he is very innocently good.
Yeah.
In the case of Andy Dufrene, it is more, as I say, a shrewd idealism. There, it's a goodness that is certainly aware of the evil around it. And so it's a little bit more nuanced than the John Coffey character, but there is still that Christ-like element of there to help and heal other people.
Definitely. I mean, I think that's what makes him really quite a good and fairly unusual character, even just aside from the symbolic aspects, is the fact that he's a really interesting depiction of a really good man who is good in quite a idiosyncratic way, actually. This really unusual blend of qualities, that would lead to somebody having that almost combination of altruism and savvy that he displays, actually. It's interesting. But
it could be the case that for Andy Dufrene that his greatest temptation was even before he entered the prison, which was when he had the gun. I think that was his real temptation point. That was him at a crossroads, and he ended up doing the right thing, which is throwing away the gun. Unfortunately, someone else killed his wife and her lover, and he gets the blame for it.
Sure.
But yeah, I think that would have been his greatest temptation there. After that, he did not seem to be tempted to do anything wrong, really. To put it colloquially, does it put a foot wrong since then? I think what's really important here is, that little episode where he plays some opera over the prison radio. Do you remember that?
Oh yeah.
And afterwards he says that there's a place inside oneself that they can't get to.
Yes.
That they can't touch. And that's the way I would put it, which I'm not saying that we can necessarily unpack it in the way that Andy Dufrene, the character, meant it, because it is more gesture towards than explained exactly what he meant by that.
Yeah.
But I think part of it is that it is so easy for the prisoners to see themselves as nobodies in certain contexts. Say, like Edward Grimes when he is released, the elderly guy.
Yeah, Brooks.
And and he feels that he is nobody in that outside world, and so he commits suicide.
Yeah.
Whereas Andy Dufrene never feels that he was nobody. He always feels that he is somebody, and he is trying to encourage that in other people, most notably Red.
Yeah, that's indeed. I mean, we'll obviously get on to the kind of relationship between the two, which is quite a fundamental aspect of the film as well. Actually, that kind of friendship, but the way that's depicted is quite unusual as well in some senses.
Oh, yes, yeah. But I suppose what he was saying anyway is that there was a goodness in him and a sense of meaning that, despite all the evil around him, it could not be contaminated or destroyed.
Yes.
Not in his case. And yet we know that many people could get so easily demoralized. But he had an extraordinary capacity to not be demoralized.
I think you're right. I mean, obviously, a little bit later on, we'll get into more of the issues of his sense of guilt and redemption, and so on. In terms of just following on from that line of thought there, the second question we're going to discuss, really, which links to what you were saying, was the qualities, attitudes, or behaviours that Andy Dufrene possesses, which allow him to escape this trap of institutionalization that's mentioned, whereby prisoners such as Brooks can't function out with the prison. They've become so, I don't know, limited as people, or so dependent that they actually
invisible,
they can't. So I mean, maybe I could give you a little, what I was kind of thinking there about so the qualities that Andy Dufrene possesses, aside from obviously his kind of these symbolic aspects and so on, because it seems I thought it's interesting that again, this complex mixture. He has this guilt that you mentioned, and therefore, to some extent, it seems he accepts his imprisonment without the degree of maybe bitterness that others, or at least resignation. It's a strange mixture. He accepts it to some extent, but he has, as you've been describing there, such a strong inner sort of compulsion towards freedom, or sense of freedom, and he can hold on to that. He's such a kind of quiet inward guy that it's like he can accept the imprisonment precisely because his this sense of freedom and his own values is so strong in him, that it just leads to this kind of strange patience, actually, and endurance, obviously he's subjected to ongoing brutal assaults by other inmates who've taken a dislike to him. There's so many things he endures, but as you said, it's this ability, I suppose, to just. It actually reminded me a little bit of our conversation about Viktor Frankl a number of months ago. About this finding meaning. This for him, the journey towards his freedom, however unlikely it might be that he'll get it, makes life meaningful for him and gives him the motivation and resolve to hang in there.
Yes, yeah.
Maybe along with a bit of a sense that, he deserved a bit of hardship because he hadn't lived his life that well, so he can sort of almost justify not what he's received, but the fact that, okay, maybe hardship was to some extent merited because he'd made bad life choices.
I mean, I think there's a number of things that could be said about that. I think the Viktor Frankl connection is a good one, and Frankl would say that Andy Dufrene, one of the reasons why he was able to not only survive, but actually have a meaningful existence within that confines of the prison, was that he lived as Frankl would put it, a self-transcending life. So, the focus on cultivating the library, the focus on teaching, the focus on encouraging things like them having the beer, to accord them some dignity. The desire quietly and in a very subtle way to develop Red's self-respect and self-belief. There is that self-transcending element there. Meanwhile, he's digging that tunnel. So that's one of the beautiful things about it. For me, it was a beautiful statement that the altruism and self-interest could coexist. It's one of the best presentations of that coexisting elements, if you see what I mean.
I think you're absolutely spot on.
And I think it's very rare to see that.
Extremely. I mean, on the one hand, at first he seems this not very sociable, inward guy. Maybe some of the other prisoners almost see him as a loner because he's quite reserved and self-contained. But as you said, everything he does that's meaningful actually involves others, even his escape ultimately, because he shares that, in the longer term with Red. So he's this funny mixture of somebody who's extremely caring, ethical, and wants connection with others, but with a really strong sense of his own individuality as well, so he can look after both. A really interesting, balanced person, and he can endure even the solitary confinement. Even that is endurable because he's got such a strong sense of himself, I think.
Well, as he said, he took Mozart with him. Into that solitary confinement. In other words, what Mozart's music meant to him, he could experience that even in solitary, in the hole, as it's called. He could be misconstrued as a loner because he has good friendships with some people there, particularly Red. He's not aloof, but I think again there is almost that. I mean, there is almost some slight shadings of the Christ subtext in that people also have defined him.
Yes,
and you see with Red that it is a meeting of Dufrene's great altruism, also with Red's great humanity too, that they're able to meet each other in that profound way. But I think my impression is with Dufrene that he was somewhat, detached from the rest of the prisoners because he did not want to immerse himself too much in that world. I think he was helping them to look up. It wasn't about him coming down to their level.
I think that's a great point. I mean, obviously, because the way it's described, for a number of months in prison initially, he is just himself. And it's really only because Red's a kind of open-minded, as you said, kind of humanitarian-minded person, actually a good person who's in there obviously having made mistakes when he was younger, that that can work. But these, like the prisoners that abuse Andy and attack him, obviously they're unpleasant individuals, but they've seen him as just conceited, and it's like a power game. They just he's become the enemy to them because of, as you said, what could be perceived as aloofness and also a failure to the fact he stands up for himself against them. They can't take that, how he doesn't fear them really. That is there's that.
Well, there is that, and you could see at these points where he's about to get raped, that he stands up for himself as much as he can, even though the odds are against him. There's four guys onto one. But I think, that the rape and the sexual dynamics in that movie, that, unfortunately for him, that because he is somewhat detached from the rest, he then becomes this sort of person that you know, certain prisoners want to rape, to possess, almost, precisely because he is also so detached, if that makes sense.
I think that's spot on. Exactly. It's that, you know, he is different, you know, and he doesn't hide that, you know, and that is both what gets him through, but also, what gets him more negative attention, as you said.
Well, yes, it makes him alluring to certain people that then, you know, repeatedly come on to him and rape him. Unfortunately, but yeah, I think that is part of it, part of what lends that desirability there for him. But I think, you know, the rapes and the and enduring that, among other things, is also to make his final freedom even more impressive and moving.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, that's right. Again, he just he avoids the trap of despair or bitterness, even though these circumstances must be unbelievably bleak, and, you know, to live like that with that threat hanging over him.
Yes.
It doesn't seem to distract him too much from his objective. And
no, I think one of the things that we've got to consider is that our experience of life and our fortitude, or our degree of fortitude, is intimately related to our expectations about life. You know, what life can give us, how difficult it's going to be. I mean, you know, therapists like Albert Ellis talked about frustration intolerance. Now, Andy Dufrene is somebody with, you know, remarkable frustration tolerance. And when read comments about the fact that Andy crawled through 3 football pitches lengths of sewage to get his freedom, I think there was a statement there about life itself and about how Andy saw it. Andy knew that life involved trawling through a lot of shit. And he accepted that. He accepted it, and he could endure that to a phenomenal extent. And because of that, he got his final freedom. And I think the religious subtext of that is, you know, very clear, which is that, you know, if this is like our hell here with all the indignities and difficulties, those that can keep the faith, maintain their integrity, and wade through it to their final salvation will be rewarded.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And you know, it's funny that you know, the unbelievably hypocritical, you know, ultimately sinister prison warden who espouses these religious maxims, you know, it's pretty clear that Andy can do that too. You know, he's absorbed these religious verses, but and you know, you don't necessarily get a sense that that's entirely insincere, but of course he's also used his Bible as the place to hide his rock hammer, you know. So it's both, you know, these teachings, you know, it's ambivalent there. It's almost like that there's a sort of faith quality to him, but there's the pragmatism as well, you know, that it's a concrete kind of faith in a way.
Yes, there is. I mean, you know, he's a little bit like the Elmer Gantry character, the Burt Lancaster character, in that how much he believes is not really that clear. How much he is religious in the very literal sense is not clear. I mean, the way I interpreted the rock hammer in the Bible was that was a beautiful condemnation of the warden's hypocrisy.
Yes.
That, you know, that this warden could quote the Bible. He could, you know, have that sign up over his safe. Again, a great illustration. You know, it was to hide the safe, where he was doing all these tax dodges. So that, you know, I think it was a condemnation of his hypocrisy, as well as a convenient place to hide it, because, you know, it would not be, you know, they wouldn't look in the Bible. And in a sense, nobody had an interest in looking at the Bible, even if they might quote from it. And so it was a safe place to hide it. But yes, I think that capacity to, well, that expectation that life could have a lot of shit that you wade through, and that you might have to wade through that to emerge from it, is something that Andy understood more so than the other prisoners, probably. And I'm also thinking about that Christian philosopher Gabriel Marcel that he wrote about patience and hope, and he saw a profound connection between the two, that hope was a kind of patience. And you see that with Andy, that he is, remarkably patient. And in a way, you can't be hopeful if you're impatient. You can't be.
Yeah. Yeah.
And, hope is playing the long game. And that's what Andy certainly was doing over those 20 years, playing the long game, and he could be hopeful. And he knew that goodness was on the other side. One of the lines that affected me the most in the, in the film, it affected me because, I hope it's true. I don't know if it's true, but, you would hope it was true, which is that goodness never dies. And, Andy, that's obviously the Christian view. That would be Stephen King's Christian worldview, that goodness doesn't die.
Yeah.
But, whether that's true or not is another story. But Andy probably believed that.
Yeah, that's an intriguing link, the idea of the patience and the hope, because, I mean, there's the scene, obviously, when he's talking to Red, and he I think he talks a little bit about that, this future that he's imagining himself having, and Red's take at that moment is, oh, you're torturing yourself, you're thinking about this stuff about what you'd really like.
Yes,
you're not, and that would seem like a kind of commonsensical view, but actually it does seem to be the fact that Andy wants freedom so desperately much, actually maybe so much, he's so connected to his kind of inner values and in which freedom is fundamental, that he can actually be more patient despite the greater the desire for it. It's that interesting mix, as you said.
Well, I think so. I mean, Marcel is a Christian, Andy as this Christ-like figure in the story, that when Andy says about there's a part of himself inside that they can't, reach. You could always say that's like the kingdom of heaven within, as a Christian would see it, and that exists, and it's how you then reach that's the issue. It's not the destination, or the existence of that place is not in question if you're a believer. It's then how you carve out your own personal salvation, and he does it literally through constructing that tunnel.
Yeah, it's quite it's so well done, in a sense that, as we just discussed, it's unclear what his particular religious beliefs might be, how much he takes the verse from the Bible literally, or he's interested in it. But I mean, like one critic that I pointed out the fact that it's defining quality of him is he's never defined by external values at all. It's entirely from within, his own perspective, which is almost like a more as you said, a lived version of Christianity that doesn't need verses, and whether or not he's interested in them, it's irrelevant. As you said, it's so embodied and it's so inner but self-transcendent. It's both of those things, through him.
Yes, yeah. I mean, he lives it. He doesn't need to read about it necessarily. So, the warden is like the Pharisees, is it? The ones that could quote scripture and feel that they're saved, but they could be hypocrites. I'm sure the warden read that Bible a lot more than what Andy did, but the thing is that the way they lived their lives was so different. In fact, the warden is, along with the prison guard, are the two most evil characters in that movie.
The movie depicts these acts of cruelty, exploitation, and corruption by both, I think it's Warden Norton and the chief prison guard, Byron Hadley, his name is. So in terms of the psychology of these individuals, or the psychology of power and authority, is there anything we could learn from this film that might kind of shed light on these characters, or the kind of actions that they they take part in.
Yeah, well, I was thinking about that, and I don't know if this was actually an intended social critique or not, but it's quite telling that what brings the warden down is the tax evasion. This idea that is something that he's definitely going to get nailed for, but the deaths in that prison and things like that go uninvestigated. So I think that there's, whether it's intended or not, there's like an implicit social critique in that if you evade your taxes, you're going to get done for that. But what really was going on in that prison, just turn a blind eye to it in many ways. So I think there is a kind of critique of that wider society, whether it's intended or not, in that movie.
I think you're right. Yep.
When you look at the prison system, you don't get the sense that they're getting vetted very often, or people coming in to observe what is happening. It just seems to be like this almost like this purgatory, doesn't it? That exists unto itself. It seems very isolated and abstract in a way that the warden is not accountable to anyone. And I think that lack of accountability means that he and his guards could run it in the way that they do. And, the prison guard that's particularly sadistic, the warden doesn't really care how he behaves, really. There's probably a kind of contempt for many of the prisoners. They're dehumanized.
It's like he works so well, the warden, as a kind of contrast to Andy, because obviously he has the kind of freedom to do as he pleases that comes with that position, as you were suggesting, of unaccountable power. But in his case, again, there's the kind of Christian allegory here. It's that kind of power corrupts story, in a way that he seems, he comes to believe in his own infallibility, and he takes part in these increasingly bold and greedy and exploitative acts, and as you said, wields the power of life or death, and has a kind of psychopathic callousness, in a way. The young prisoner that could spoil it by helping to clear Andy's name, he has him killed. I mean, it's unbelievably ruthless.
I mean, that was one of the darkest movies. One of the darkest scenes in the movie, when the young man is killed.
And I mean, again, both these characters, the guard Hadley, who, almost smiles, could kill a person absolutely without any reason, without batting an eyelid, essentially. And again, the warden that could order a death in that way, just because it, his business interests, if you could call them that, were under threat at that point. So just the worst kind of human corruption, really, actually, in those two characters.
Well, it is, I mean, I do believe that if the warden had pursued what Andy had told him, and Andy had had a hearing and had been acquitted, that he wouldn't have dobbed the warden in. I mean, he says that he wouldn't do that. I don't think he would have, but the warden doesn't believe in that level of trust and integrity. He doesn't recognize it. He doesn't know it. So his view is, if I let this man out, he is going to turn me in. And so because he has no respect for the prisoners' lives, he could just get that young man killed, just as we see that prisoner arrive along with Andy, is killed on that night by the sadistic guard. I think what we see from a psychological point of view is the real dangers of splitting, and this is something that we all do to some extent. We split people into, good and evil, innocent and guilty. What Melody Klein was talking about, the psychoanalyst, is that we can split, features, and then identify with what we think is the more desirable element.
Sure.
And the danger of that then is that if you're in an environment where you've got the license to do that psychological splitting, and society also backs you up that these prisoners are the baddies, then you can then feel that you're innocently good. And I think that's influenced how the warden and the sadistic guard look at themselves. They feel that they are a different kind of species to the prisoners. In a way, ironically, they're right, because the level of sadism is something that we don't see in the prisoners. Of course, that is cleverly done, because, you know, unfortunately, there would be some prisoners that probably are as sadistic as them in real life. You know, if you're looking at a typical prison population, but you know, leaving aside that aspect, they are actually different to the prisoners because they're more sadistic, more inhumane. And yes, and I think that's the danger of seeing yourself believing in your own goodness and innocence to that extent.
Yeah, I think that's an intriguing point. I like the as you said, this sort of socially sanctioned splitting that these kind of institutions create does actually cause this kind of peculiar inversion, because you're right. I mean, the prisoners in the film, apart from, I think it's Boggs, you know, the ones that attack and rape Andy and so on, aside from those, you know, sadistic individuals, obviously it was realistic enough to show there are such people. Most of the prisoners are portrayed fairly positively and seem like reasonably okay people, or reasonably good people in some cases. Whereas, yeah, as you said, it's precisely the superior position that's accorded these guards that, of course, it's it's attracted sadistic individuals, actually, like Hadley, who would love that, you know, that ability to be violent and wield power over others. And in his case, it's not clear. Probably you would imagine he's become captain of the guards, he's become more and more violent, and he's been rewarded within that system. And it's a similar story with the warden. I mean, I'm not sure, I don't know what your take on this would be. His, you know, these religious, you know, verses that he spouts, I wasn't entirely sure whether the film was suggesting this was completely cynical necessarily, you know, or whether he actually did, to some extent, actually still believe himself to be a good figure, or whether it was just completely to mask his money grubbing activities. I'm not sure, but
yeah, I mean, that's a good question. My sense was that he did actually believe in those values as he understood them.
Yeah, I thought that too.
I think there was a sincerity there, but it was so profoundly misguided. But then, you know, I'm sure there were people that believed they were good Christians and yet they were Nazis, murdering Jews.
Yep.
So I'm sure you had that. It's actually that real moral blindness there. That, yes, I think the warden, that because he was the warden and not a prisoner, and yet he was overseeing these prisoners, I think he believed that his salvation was assured. He thought that he was, you know, doing the right thing, that he was a good man, and that he knew the way. When he was, you know, a much more corrupt person than many of the prisoners. He did not see that irony, neither did the head prison guard.
I think you're right.
As well. I think also, if you look at it from a psychological point of view, that, I mean, Red just says this is an offhanded comment, but he says that when Hadley's taken away, he cried like a baby. When he's lifted by the police for his tax evasions, that he cried like a baby. And I think, okay, we could just take that as a kind of irony, that we could laugh at him, you know, because he was so awful to other people. He was a murderer, actually. But I think there is a kind of psychological depth to be plumbed there, which is that, you know, perhaps when he was beating these prisoners up, he was beating up the vulnerable side of himself that he had contempt for as well. You often see that in sadists.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I think you're right. I mean, it was, you know, he was so remarkably super sensitive in a way, because, you know, the horrific, you know, killing in the start of the film of the, you know, the prisoner who almost essentially has a panic attack and can't be quiet.
Yeah,
you know, it's like to Hadley, he reacts as if that's some kind of personal descent, you know. Well, either he, you know, it's like for him, obedience must come and it just must be crushed. And as you said, it's deranged, you know, that level of, you know, that could generate such anger when somebody's obviously in a state of extreme fear. But yeah, it's like he is crushing something literally. I think you're right. That's also within himself. He just can't tolerate the sight of it. Weakness,
he has a profound contempt for that weakness or for that fear. He cannot empathize with the vulnerability of it. He cannot say, well, this is a man that has found himself in prison, a very life-changing moment, a very scary moment, and he can't see the humanity in the other, because I think he has disowned that part of himself, and that's another reason why he's so hardened and so sadistic.
Definitely, and I think it's interesting as well that, you know, this, as you described earlier, this kind of scenario where this has been possible, this kind of splitting, and, you know, this kind of route towards corruption and horror that the guards and the warden experience is exactly made possible by the kind of the social conditions, you know, this kind of hierarchy whereby it's made possible for those with power to be unaccountable in certain environments, and how you know, grotesque that can become. I wondered, just as a sort of supplementary to this, you know, do you think this film, what it's offering here, is actually a critique of imprisonment in general, maybe for that, or just for other reasons as well, or do you think it's not really, you know, the social message isn't quite so far-reaching?
Yeah, well, I mean, if you're portraying the head prison guard as particularly sadistic, and you're conveying the fact that he's reached that position, as you intimated, through probably being the most sadistic, that there is an implicit critique there. I mean, I'm not saying that Stephen King, for example, saw it as fundamentally a critique of the prison system, because again, it is set in the past, for one thing.
Yeah.
But I'm sure it's a critique of a society where prisoners are seen as the other, and then they're left to a system that there's no real accountability, and those that are more sadistic can rise in position, in power and influence. Then it does seem like it is a critique of that kind of prison system. To me, in as far as it was a critique, it was you know, the scenario with the library seems to me to be a critique, because, you know, Andy is able to create that library, build it up, mainly because he's helping to fill out these tax dodging forms for the warden. I mean, you know, the warden did tell him that the library would be closed down, toot sweet, if he did not comply with what he wanted. So in a sense, the library is a testament to Andy's patience and dedication. It's also a testament to his shrewdness, you know, helping the warden out. But it is saying that ordinarily at that time in a prison, there would not be that level of culture, not that level of developing prisoners' potentials.
I think so. Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think insofar as there is a critique, and as you said, I think we could overstate that. But I mean, insofar as there is, I think you're right. That, to me, it struck me that there was kind of both a moral dimension and a kind of more instrumental dimension to that critique, because obviously this is very much, you know, showing the horror of a situation in which, you know, the prison is created such as to be humiliating, intimidating, you know, the delousings, the cold showers, the beatings, all this kind of stuff. So it's very clearly, as you said, this is prison as it was in the past at the time the film was made. So clearly that's a fairly straightforward critique of that kind of brutality and inhumane conditions. But I think you're right, that to me there's an instrumental point as well, actually, because the library and what we see, you know, how hard it is for Andy to convince politicians or those in kind of office that it's worth spending a little bit of money trying to let prisoners have access to books and do qualifications. Obviously, a kind of, you know, a more modern take on prison would be that, you know, apart from the fact it's good for the individual prisoners as people, it's also good for society if you create people that are rehabilitated. You know, they can get jobs and they've learned to be better human beings. So there's a kind of instrumental factor there that prison wasn't really done very well. You know, it's just essentially cruel and ineffective. In that system.
I mean, exactly. I mean, you know, if it was left to the devices of Hadley and the warden, then what lessons are people really learning? I mean, rehabilitation under that sort of regime is like learning just to fear authority. Is that what rehabilitation is about? Is that the essence of it? That if you are let go, if you're released from the prison, that just fear your bosses and your figures of authority, your superiors, as it's often called. Is that the lesson that they wanted them just to learn?
Yeah.
That isn't really much of a rehabilitation of a human being. It's not really the development of a human being. Whereas Andy understood that having this library and this chance for prisoners to get an education was not only good for their own self-respect, it was also good for society, because they could go back into that world with greater self-respect and a greater chance of contributing to that society in a constructive way, which is, as you say, good for society.
Yeah, it's like, as you intimated earlier, the implicit mindset that the prison staff and I guess it's suggesting society to some extent at that time operated under was that if you're imprisoned, you're a degenerate, and it's essentially like your life is effectively over at that point. I mean, obviously we see Red his parole keeps getting rejected and rejected,
Yeah.
and Brooks, the elderly prisoner as well. They've kept them in for so long that they can't. That's it. They've just warehoused them to the point of death. Really, it's like they're seen as irredeemably bad, and in a very lazy way. Without really thinking about, well, are they? Or what might they be capable of?
Yeah. Well, I mean, you know that in the Victorian era, it was very common to see prisoners as degenerates, as regressive, in some way, closer to the animal. I mean, we covered that with Jekyll and Hyde, that ideology.
Yeah. Sure.
And probably back in the 40s and 50s in America, that, it would be seen as that they were losers, nobodies, degenerates. And then the thing is about containing them. But then there's this rehabilitation program, and how is that meant to work out if you don't treat them with, humanity and encourage their self-respect and give them a chance to, fit back into society? I mean, if we look at the young man that was killed by the warden, shot by Hadley, that he was someone that probably didn't have much chances in his life up until that point, and then Andy's tuition helped him to get the education that would have been precisely what he needed to go back into that world and join it in such a way that he could contribute and obviously help his own family there. So, but that is not what Hadley and the warden understand.
No.
I mean, what you kind of see there is a sort of mentality that I'm just thinking about Charles Lawton's Captain Bligh.
Okay.
That know how his attitude towards the sailors on his ship is similar to Hadley and the wardens. How Bligh says, "I'm your captain, your judge, and your jury here." And I think that's the thing, that there is this concentration of power in someone with great moral poverty, and what comes with that is a disturbing paranoia towards other people. So Hadley and Bligh, not that they're in the same movie, but Hadley and Bligh have the same view, which is that these people need to be kept down. You've got to intimidate them. You've got to strike fear in them, because that's the only way that they're going to behave.
I think that's a great point. I mean, as you said, it's a fundamentally paranoid view, and I thought, it's really interesting that, again, the issue you raised earlier about the fact that these deaths in prison that are obviously, there's no doubt an official story being given. There's no sense that they're investigated. It's just assumed that prisoners will die from, well, it's beatings, and of course they say, oh, it was an escape attempt, and that level of potential crime is seen as not worth looking at, because precisely of a kind of paranoid view that these people are sort of, not even second-class citizens, just dehumanized. Whereas, as you suggested, the tax dodging, boom, you know, there's certainly a sort of implicit sense of a society with very skewed values at that time.
Yes, yeah, because I mean, you know, him cheating on his taxes like that is something to be flagged up and prosecuted. But the fact that, you know, they swooped down on him literally in that prison, the degree of shame involved is in excess to, you know, what would have happened if there'd been some inquiry.
Well, indeed,
about the deaths of these prisoners.
Suicide, doesn't he?
Yeah, exactly. But I think the point the film is making, whether intentionally or not, is that yes, this society will query tax forms, but it won't really query deaths in a prison.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you know, so it's the thing of priorities not being quite right. There, I mean, you know, the prisoner that dies at the start of the movie, I'm sure there was no inquiry. They would just say that you know, he suffered a heart attack or something, or he, you know, they had to, you know, quiet him down, and he got aggressive, so they hit him, and this happened. Or there'd be many reasons many stories that could come up with to account for that, and it's not something that the wider society or even prison service think it's worth investigating. But your tax forms, that's a different story. Your tax, you know, forms, that's a different sort of story altogether.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting as well. Again, that same mindset, you know, in the way that parole hearings are depicted in the films, you know, because obviously we see Red at a point in his life where he's a you know, a middle-aged man, I guess. He's committed a murder in his youth. We don't know an awful lot about it, other than we know that he's changed a lot as a person, and he realizes, you know, that he's done something horrible, and he seems to have, you know, genuinely repented. But, you know, the parole hearings where he obviously tries to say what they want to hear, they you know, it's impossible. He can't get through to them, and they're just not interested in paroling him. You know, it's like it's a kind of box ticking exercise whereby he's murdered somebody. He's therefore never to be released until he's so old that he's no longer any kind of risk. But again, there's, you know, obviously some people would take the view that if you murder somebody, you should have a whole life sentence and so on. That's a slightly different debate. But certainly there's no real belief in the possibility of rehabilitation. And as you said, you know, these people have obviously, you know, had starts in life that are going to lead them to make bad choices. It doesn't mean they're irredeemable, you know, evil-natured people. In all cases, you know, clearly,
well, I mean, that is certainly not the view that the movie is proposing, you know, or espousing. They obviously believes in redemption, and you know, it's not saying that, you know, once a killer or murderer, always a killer or murderer. We don't know the circumstances of that murder with Red, you know, who he murdered. I don't think I recall it anyway.
It really doesn't go into, other than he just laments it as a young man.
Yeah, I mean, it was something that he did as a young man. It's not clear what exactly the circumstances. I think it's kept deliberately vague, so that it's again easier to see that redemption. But the idea for rehabilitation, I mean, in one sense you could see why we have it, but the danger of it is, as you say, it can become a box ticking exercise. But another danger of it is that it can implicitly assume that the society that you were potentially rejoining is not the problem, or isn't a problem at all. Anyway, I think that's a more accurate way of putting it, that it isn't a problem at all, which I think is as much a problem as the prisoners having committed crimes. You know, rehabilitating the individual overlooks the fact that maybe society has to be rehabilitated in some ways too.
Final question we're going to get onto was about this issue of redemption. One thing I read that was interesting was that the film it was a disappointment in terms of number of people that came to see it when it was first released at the cinema, and they put that down to the fact of the title of the film, The Shawshank Redemption, just being something that maybe confused people, and apparently it was really only when it came out in VHS and through word of mouth, blah blah blah, it became a hit kind of belatedly. So, but anyway, in terms of the issue of redemption, that is in the title of the movie, what do you see? I know we've touched on this earlier, but what do you see as the redemption, given, of course, that Andy is actually innocent of the crime that he's convicted of?
Yeah, well, I mean, my take on that is that it's not got anything specifically to do with Andy's redemption. I think the redemption is for Red, not Andy.
Right, interesting.
Because as you say, Andy was innocent.
Yeah.
He does not need redeemed, actually, but he is the way to Red's redemption. And the reason I say that is that Red goes through this eternal return, or so it seems, of parole meetings, or to see whether he could be rehabilitated or not. And he just comes in and he doesn't really fight for himself, or he doesn't really believe that he could ever be rehabilitated. He's probably not sure whether he is rehabilitated. He doesn't have a concept of it. He has no sense of what he could become or what he now is until he meets Andy, and his friendship with Andy gives him a sense of his own goodness and how he's changed, that he is not remotely that murderer when he was 17 or whatever age he was as a young man. He can recognize a journey. He has made a journey, and he can believe in his own goodness, and believing in that, he can go to that final meeting and be very honest about his regret. I think he can only acknowledge the regret when he can also recognize what he's achieved as a person since then.
I think that's a really interesting take on it, Alec. Yeah, I mean, I don't necessarily disagree with that. What struck me was the idea that I thought the redemption was about both Andy and Red. I think, I mean, just because I looked, the definition of redemption. It suggests the action of being saving or being saved from sin, error, and evil. And obviously, you could say Andy is doing to some extent the saving of Red. I kind of wondered whether the redemption, if there was any redemption for Andy as well. I mean, we could, that may or may not be the case. You could say, somebody who was living an unhappy life, lacking in meaning. He talks about the fact that he feels he ruined his marriage because he was such a closed book. It's like he feels, rightly or wrongly, he's judging himself for a failure maybe to communicate with his wife and bridge that gap. So, if there's a redemption for him, perhaps you could say, he feels that he's making up for, bad choices and mistakes he's made to some extent. But I must say, I do agree with you about Red, because, I mean, obviously the fact that, the film ends with the two friends reunited on the beach. I mean, Red is fundamental to this, happy ending in this film. And exactly as you said, Red's been in there longer, he's waited a long time, and he's also more dependent, actually. He's needing saved because he can't save himself.
Well, I think that, I mean, there's a lot of interesting points you made there, and the first thing I would say is that I see Red as maybe not the main character in a way, but the protagonist nevertheless. That he is the one that has that journey more as an individual.
Sure.
And that even if he's not necessarily the main character, in a way it's got parallels to One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, in that McMurphy is the catalyst for the chief, the Indian patient in the hospital, who in his case breaks free. I'm sure that's been an influence on this movie, because again, it is about escaping a repressive institution.
Sure.
And it's got a similarity of the chief escaping. It's maybe not quite as dramatic as Andy's escape, but there is a similar feeling to it. I think an argument could be made that Andy has a redemption of sorts, but for me, yes, even if he had those weaknesses in his pre-prison life, and his choices in the prison change him. I think it's I think it's a more subtle change, and so it's not a more obvious redemption. I know that when he confessed to those weaknesses in his pre-prison life, that was important to him to growing as a person in a way.
Yeah.
But whether that explained the adultery is another question. That is,
of course, yeah.
So I wasn't quite sure how much blame he should take in that regard. He did seem to explain the adultery solely by his own neglect, as he saw it.
Yeah.
And there is that issue that, how reliable his judgment is there. He might be telling the truth, he might be spot on, or it may be more complicated. It's a bit like when clients come to sessions and when they open up about mistakes they've made. You have to be careful because, it seems like a moment of growth, and it may be, but then people have a capacity through guilt to misrecognize or even distort what has happened. So It could be complex. It can be a complex process of working out where blame can be accorded, really, there. And because we didn't really see that in Andy's case, that's why it didn't seem so much a redemption to me. But I agree that maybe it's seen as one in a way, whereas Red's journey, okay, we don't know about who he killed and why he killed them, but we're kind of more, we're obviously in Red's head. We hear his thoughts, the voiceover, and so we're a bit more privy to that change there. But yes, I'm not wanting to monopolize one interpretation there. The reason I offered the interpretation that I'd given was just to emphasize, in my view, that there was a redemption.
Yeah, exactly.
But yes, I think also that because Andy has, as some critics have suggested, albeit they saw it in quite a negative way, because he has some messianic shadings or Christ-like dimensions to him.
Yep.
It's not, Red is somebody that is, human, through and through. Whereas I think that juxtaposition of Andy as a human being with flaws like emotionally neglecting his wife, along with the messianic elements, kind of blend together in an uneasy way to think about redemption. And so, whereas with Red, he's never meant to be anything but a human being, albeit, a particularly good human being. Whereas, Andy has a number of narrative and symbolic duties to perform in that movie.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. Yeah, I mean, I suppose using words like redemption, suggests a kind of miraculous or almost religious element to what's happening. It's something kind of magical, and obviously, as you said, that requires the kind of messianic or the character that's almost beyond human to make something miraculous happen. So yeah, I think that's a fair point.
It's I'm sure the redemption was meant to include Andy as well. I'm just saying that it is a bit more complex in his case, at least in my opinion.
I think so. I mean, it's one of the kind of nicely, nuanced things about the film. It's also, one of the other nice things about it, obviously it's such an incredibly popular film, and people who watch the film have often described it as having a kind of, almost redemptive effect on themselves. There was I read one quote actually when I was looking about it. So, because both Morgan Freeman and Tim Robbins talk about the fact that wherever they go, constantly people tell them how much they like this film and how much it moved them and it had a big impact on their life, you know. So it's obviously, you know, both have been in a lot of films. I mean, Morgan Freeman in particular has been in so many films, a lot of really good films, but this movie really resonated with the public and continues to, actually, you know, 20 plus years after. There was actually apparently one former inmate of the actual prison that was used, you know, as the setting for the film, obviously being closed at that point, who said he had renounced a life of crime and drugs and become a trainee pastor and so on after having watched that film. You know, I mean, it's remarkable. So it certainly has an uplifting quality to it, really, doesn't it? There's something really quite special about it.
Yes, well, I mean, you know, the idea of freedom and redemption is such a powerful theme. It is such a powerful motive.
Yeah.
And you could argue, a bit like how it is in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest as well, that we're all, or a lot of us, are in our metaphorical prisons. And that, you know, we have to, or we can, if we've got enough courage and hope and fortitude, that we can break free from that. And that is like a fundamental hope. And if you're a Christian, say, you would also think it reflects the fact that this world is a prison itself in some ways. You know, it is not the underlying reality, but it is something that you have to endure and do your best in to then lead to another better world.
Yeah, I mean, that is a point, isn't it? It takes, you know, a very specific, vivid prison setting, you know, but as you say, you know, because I think apparently notoriously prison films sometimes have kind of limited appeal. You know, some people don't like to watch films about prison or they find it too upsetting. But as you said, it's because that you can really take so much from this about life more broadly, about the importance of hope and freedom. It is so inspiring, actually, even you know, for people who it might not be their kind of typical kind of film, or they might not like the violent elements or whatever it may be. You know, there is just something really human about this, and really kind of touching upon some of our highest aspirations, actually, in this film, you know, in a way that's, I don't think is cheesy. Actually, I think it really is quite well done, you know, and quite genuinely moving.
Yeah, well, I mean, that using the rock hammer to build this tunnel to break free, I mean, that's a testament to doing something daily towards achieving something of note. It could be achieving something that isn't a form of redemption, but it could include that. Of course it can.
But it works so well, doesn't it, as a kind of metaphor for just...
Well, it does. It does. I mean, you know, you could say that most of us are doing that or trying to do that. And despair, well, there'd be various forms of despair. One would be that believing there's no tunnel out. That would be one form of despair. Another form of despair is to, you know, create a bit of the tunnel, then give up.
Yeah,
you know, absolutely. And not to continue, not to have the patience and the dedication to see it through. But what we have is a brilliant illustration of someone that had all the qualities needed to break free.
Yeah.
And I mean, you know, that is watching it and identifying with the characters, it can be a very inspiring message. I think when you start to probe it a bit more, that you can start to think, well, goodness, there's got to be a lot that has to come together to achieve this. And that is one of the reasons why, you know, many of us don't do an Andy in our actual lives.
It's a good point. That, I mean, there's the famous line, you know, about Andy, but that Red says something like, "Some birds just aren't meant to be caged; their feathers are too bright." So I suppose, if you're religious, you know, the film, you know, essentially, as you said, the redemption for Red is because Andy is this exceptional, you know, beyond human character. But yeah, it's not that Red could do this for himself, actually, because, you know, such a rare combination of factors are needed to be an Andy, and not everybody can be an Andy. So it then kind of leads to the question about, it's hopeful in a way, this film, but yeah, you're right, there is also the issue of what would people make of that in terms of what they could do for themselves, you know, if
I
they
mean,
don't have a
the
faith,
Andes, well, the Andes of this world, in a way, don't need anyone else. You know, they will be able to achieve their own salvation. And I think in this movie, we're meant to identify more with Red. This idea that we're all Reds. We need an Andy in our life to help us achieve that. And that may be true, but I think if you're looking at it in a realistic way, that there's not many Reds either, to be honest. You know, so while Red is meant to be the everyman, he's not really the everyman, actually.
No, he's quite an exceptional
You
guy
know,
too. Yeah, you're right.
You know, he's quite exceptional too, but
Yeah.
he's meant to be the everyman. You know, just like Josh Bailey was the everyman, I believe. But but you know, I don't see much evidence of that. And so Red is quite unusual too. So when you actually look at these two people, you see a thing of exceptionality there, and while it may be inspiring to viewers, how easy it is to emulate it is another matter.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, one thing that struck me, you know, both positively and negatively, you could see this film as a kind of Christianized take on the American dream, really, you know, because obviously Andy has a kind of fall and rebirth, but due to these incredible personal qualities and his perseverance, he gains freedom, wealth as well, actually, because he cashes in on the wardens, you know, so there is a kind of, so yeah, it's like both that's a possibility, but also it's a rarity. You know, not everybody's going to do that.
Well, it is in reality. I mean, you know, the narrative psychologist Dan McAdams, he's written about narratives redemption being so prevalent in America. You know, that they love narratives of redemption, and this is certainly a narrative literally of redemption. And as you say, there is the American dream aspect, because this is an aspect we haven't really discussed too much here, but you know, Andy Dufrene was vice president of a bank, and there is a critique of society implicitly, but there is also this sense of someone that's the vice president of a bank could also be a Christ-like figure. Well, good luck with that one in reality. But I think that's why it's sort of appealing to a number of bases. You know, that you could watch this if you're an American as a Democrat, I think, and relate to it, but also as a Republican. So in that way, it ends up being a little bit apolitical in that regard, you know, or at least adhering to what is seen as core values of that country, like the thing of you know, achieving something and achieving wealth, because you know, Andy does achieve that. He had it before prison, of course, and he has it after prison, and you can see the difference between him and the old man that was the librarian, that when he leaves prison, he has to get a very ordinary job, you know, packing groceries at a supermarket. Whereas Andy, having been a vice president of a bank, when he leaves, he has the financial savvy to you know, go away with all that money and you know, lead this great life. So yes, it's like an amalgam of different things here.
It's a good point. Yeah, maybe that does it, because obviously we've talked about the kind of social critique aspect, but I think it's true. There is something actually for everybody on all sides of the political spectrum there that they could see as, to some extent, their values coming across in this film. And as you said, maybe because they're particularly American values or American Christian values, or however you would, you know, that it's going to have that wide appeal. And when you maybe look at it a little bit more closely, maybe it is a little bit suspect in some sense, or a little bit.
Well, I think that, you know, I think it has to be, you know, that inspiring messages are ones that obviously can be very motivating to us by the very definition. And maybe the trick in life is getting a balance between inspiring or being inspired and also something that can survive scrutiny too.
It's a tricky balance, isn't it?
It's a very tricky balance, and you know, I think that this movie is very inspiring, and it offers up a a metaphor for our lives, you know, that
Yeah.
we're all digging our own tunnels,
Yeah.
or we can or should be. And so say if you're in a job that you don't like at all, but you see a good retirement ahead, that's your tunnel.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
But of course, life being life, you might die a week after you retire, or you might not get to your retirement.
Sure.
So one of the things that I felt watching this movie was that, you know, it was very Hollywood in a sense, and that there was this great poetic justice. You know, it was very well written, but it was very much of that ilk where good wins out on in every way, really.
Yeah.
And so in a way, it was both inspiring. I must admit, I cried at the end of it.
Yeah.
So I was very moved by it. It was inspiring, but it was also somewhat pat as well.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, I suppose that's it, isn't it? These kind of inspirational films are great, you know, but you can't, you know, necessarily let it go to your head entirely as well. There's both. It's lovely to be moved by these things, but of course we can't confuse it with reality completely, although it's got its real hopeful, you know, or idealistic in a way elements of it that are motivating.
Well, I think so. Yeah. I mean I think the reality is that in actual life we have to work out as best as we can what we should be inspired by, what we should work towards, and what we should be resigned to. And there's no real roadmap for that, and it's so easy to get it wrong.
Yeah, that's true. You're absolutely right. Yeah, we don't
really know, and you know, having hope is certainly necessary for life. So, but it's what we should hope, and when we should hope, and to what extent we should hope is never that clear. I mean, Frankl in his book Man's Search for Meaning gives a good example of that, because some of the prisoners were hoping that they would be liberated from Auschwitz near Christmas time. And then when that liberation never came, many of them died, you know, defeated, demoralized. And so hope is a very necessary thing. But one of the things that this movie doesn't portray is that hope can be dangerous, or it can be ironically damaging as well. Hope is not just this unalloyed good, you know, this pure good. It's a complex thing. We need to have hope, but what we hope for, and to the extent that we hope, we have to be careful there.
I think so. I mean, I guess, you know, in Andy's situation in this film, it's so straightforward. He's in prison. He shouldn't be. He doesn't want to be. And what he hopes for is freedom. It's such a straightforward path. But yeah, as you said, in a way, it's hard to know necessarily what to hope for in some cases, or maybe people hope for something like you suggested. Maybe somebody's hoping for a retirement, but yeah, maybe actually that's, you know, kind of a wrong path for them, insofar as maybe they need to act sooner rather than grinding out at something unsatisfying. You know, there's obviously lots of ways in which our choices are less clear cut, you know, as to what is the right thing to do and how much hope should be motivating us, or, you know, or not.
Well, it is, and I can't remember the precise words, but you know, Plato had written that you know, that you mortals shall have whatever you want, and you know, that will be your downfall. That was the sentiment there. So there was this sort of sinister warning that you know, that is more colloquial expressed: beware of what you wish for, because you may get it. So, you know, people could hope for something, attain it, and then they realize either the vanity of it, or that actually comes with downsides. You know, so hope is not a straightforward thing. And yet, as this movie illustrates, and as Frankl illustrated, we need it. But, you know, it is what sustains us. But, you know, it isn't something that we just do and it'll all work out well. Frankl saw that himself in Auschwitz.
Yeah, I think you're. I mean, it's fascinating, but yeah, that is where that's the sort of more bittersweet
Well, that was
case,
just
though,
my
isn't it?
side
That's
of
the,
it
yeah,
all.
that's it.
You know, that it goes back to the point I made right at the beginning about our expectations of life and of other people, that we have to try and calibrate them as wisely as we can, and it can be hard to know how much we're overestimating or underestimating, being overly ambitious or under ambitious. There's rarely clear guidelines on that.
Indeed, yeah. I am conscious. Obviously, our time is
Yes,
kind of getting on here, Alec. Is it such a fascinating subject matter? And obviously, you know, we could go on, obviously, with probing that. But I guess we'll maybe have to leave that for another episode. But
yes, thank you.
So thank you, yeah, for a good conversation.
Thank you.